Clive suggested today that I talk about, we kicked around various options. One was editing Blood on the Nash Ambassador, that collection of essays that was published late 80s. And there's really not much of a story to tell there, in that the editing process was, I don't remember, any tantrums that took place were probably mine, rather than Eric's. I've repressed them in the memory. And then Clive suggested, how about something on Eric and politics? And I thought, okay, I'll talk about that, what I can say about it. In part because I thought it might well generate amongst the audience more debate, questions, food fights. Let's see. I might have smelled a rat. There's little by way of politics or parties in Eric's writing, so I might have smelled a rat when Clive suggested it, or a day at the beach. Nothing much to say. I don't think campaigns, manifestos were the kinds of things that my former teacher, Clive at Warwick, had in mind. Perhaps a better clue to, I think, what Clive had in mind was Kurt Weill's distinction between writing poems, writing political poems, and writing poems politically. If Eric didn't write about politics, certainly not about political parties, didn't teach about politics, he certainly did both of those things politically. It informed all of his activities. I've got half an hour, so apologies for omissions, simplifications, errors of fact, and what Huckleberry Finn called stretchers. There are probably one or two stretchers in here. In my experience, Eric always thought of himself as a socialist. This is a stance he told Wolfgang Gottschalker in October 1993, that had appealed to him as early as the age of 12, as a young boy. Was that due to knowledge of poverty, of the Depression, of mass unemployment? He recalled in one of his interviews with Peter John Skeld, he recalled press headlines about the Jarrow March when he was a child, but I don't believe he experienced deprivation firsthand. Perhaps it evinced his socialist interests, evinced youthful reading of Lewis Mumford, someone he'd read as a teenager. Maybe it was just an adolescent gang member attitude. Whatever the impetus was, and I'm not sure Eric himself knew, the stance endured during wartime, his student years, and well beyond. To speak of his apparent political nihilism, as our friend, the late Stuart Kidd, did some years ago, is to my mind tendentious. I didn't see nihilism in Eric's politics. While Eric thought of himself as a socialist, I think he was less a revolutionary than a Fabian, at least in later life, though I'm happy to be corrected. Eric sometimes invoked the Labour Party's Clause 4 reference to the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange, which came originally from the Fabian Society. And he was proud of his father's work with Aneurin Bevan in the early post-war years, setting up the National Health Service. But the Fabian label, I don't think, attaches all that tightly. If Eric came in his later years to share the Society's gradualism, I think he had less faith in his fellow citizens' wisdom, in majority rule, or in British parliamentary democracy. Although open to anyone both able and willing to embrace learning, Eric's constituency was no more a majority than it was a political vanguard. So I think there's something to the Fabian attachment. I'm going to come back to it. But it's not that sticky a label. In any case, Eric's politics owed little to movements, to parties, or to policies. If the Fabian tag is justified, indeed, I think it has more to do with the society's early cultural radicalism, late 19th century cultural radicalism, embodied in writers like Edward Carpenter, George Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells, all of whom had certainly read Marx. At the same time, although Eric, like these earlier writers, certainly drew on Marxist ideals, he, like they, also departed from them. Allegiance to any one set of ideas, like allegiance to a party, carried with it for Eric the spectre of dogma. Nor could one say that Eric was a Marxist literary critic, along the lines of, say, Georg Lukács. The artist was always more important to Eric than the critic. The artwork preceded the theory. In any case, any theory that Eric embraced, his methods sooner or later tended to disrupt. A useful way to highlight how Marx was salient to Mottram's politics is not to focus on concepts, not to think in terms of capital and class, or not to start with capital and class, base and superstructure, alienation, reification, but to think in terms of the writers whose work Eric admired. They included a handful, obviously from a long list, Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Adams, Mark Twain, William Burroughs, Hubert Selby, Norman Mailer, Thomas Pynchon. Whatever else drew him to the work of these authors, one common factor was its attention to power, as exercised by the commanding officer, the judge, the politician, the bureaucrat, the technician, the entrepreneur, the priest, the therapist, the doctor, even the teacher. All of these authors, and many of the other authors he was interested in, interrogated authority in all its varied forms. And Eric's considerations of power, of authority, perhaps more precisely the authoritarian, and the obedience they imposed or they invoked, I think they're integral to an understanding of Eric's politics. Into the fields of information that Eric cultivated as part of these considerations, he deployed not only works like Capital, the economic and philosophic manuscripts, but also studies in the Marxist tradition that built on those original works. These included texts by, amongst others, Antonio Gramsci and Wilhelm Reich. Gramsci, partly for his work on hegemony and obedience, Reich for his analysis of what he called the mass psychology of fascism, a book published in 1933. That book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, contributed to a larger reconfiguration and radical critique of the discipline of psychology, not least of Freudian psychoanalysis, elaborated by Reich, Paul Goodman, Herbert Marcuse, Thomas Saz, Noam Chomsky, and R.D. Laing, amongst others. A grasp of Mottram's dismantling of Freud, I think, is just as salient to an understanding of his politics as is a sense of his critical engagements with Marx. Eric saw value in playing psychology and Marxism into one another, but he didn't find Herbert Marcuse's coinage of hybrid phrases such as surplus repression particularly useful. They left him in Mottram's pejorative terms of Freudian. At this point, I should say a thank you to John Whiting for putting all of those recordings of Eric's classes, or seminars that John attended at the end of the 1960s, early 1970s, online, available to all of us, because I attended many classes with Eric in the latter part of the 1970s, and recall listening to John's tapes reminded me, oh, that's right, yes, that would fit in with notes that I took at the time. But there's nothing better than being able to listen to Eric, to listen to his classes from years ago, to remind oneself, oh yes, that was Eric. While Marcuse had given up on the working class as a revolutionary vanguard, he still assumed that ethnic, social, cultural identities afforded an adequate grasp of consciousness, of praxis. And that premise only draw Eric Mottram's disdain. In fact, I think little incensed Eric more than claims of authority, of innocence, of permission that were based solely on appeals to ethnicity, to race, to gender. I can hear him now in my mind. But if Eric cited John Dos Passos's caustic Communist Manifesto parody, "Intellectual workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your brains," Eric could spit proletarian bullets with the best of them. In a letter to the American poet Robert Duncan in 1971, for example, he denounced Stuart Brand's countercultural Whole Earth catalogue as so much middle-class moneyed snobbery. I wish I'd realised that at the time, as a card-carrying or Whole Earth catalogue-carrying non-middle-class, non-moneyed, non-snob. If I'd realised that at the time, Clive, I might have had second thoughts when you suggested you should go and study with Eric Mottram. As if repudiating Stuart Brand's 1964 slogan, "America needs Indians," Eric insisted that the American working class had no desire to live in the static abomination of the tribe. He may well have been right. Still, his assertions were every bit as categorical in their appeal, in this case to class. For all of his friendships, with an admiration for writers associated with the post-war era, with William Burroughs, with Allen Ginsberg, with Michael McClure, I suspect Eric's political affinities were at least as much with the old left as with the new, closer to some of the preceding generation's writers, people like George Oppen, for example. I had just sensed that in Eric's writings, that there's more of a sympathy for what in American terms was the old left. All of this may make Eric Mottram seem a powerful but incongruous amalgam of, let's say, Harry Bridges and John Wayne, or what would the British equivalent be? Arthur Scargill and a British libertarian, William Rees-Mogg. That's pushing it. That's a stretcher. But it's precisely here, imprecisely here, where the self meets the social, where class engages consciousness, where alienation and schizophrenia are one, as Norman Brown put it. It's precisely at those points that the radical critiques that I referred to earlier are of particular value, from Reich's criticism of Freudian practice to Paul Goodman's adoption of some of Reich's ideas and methods within Gestalt therapy, from Chomsky's demolition of B.F. Skinner's behaviorism, via Thomas Sazer's attack on institutional psychiatry, onto R.D. Laing's existential phenomenological approach. That work collectively describes key features, to my mind, of the intellectual territory against which Eric's politics can be gauged. Last person I mentioned there was R.D. Laing. Laing was not only Mottram's closest contemporary in terms of age of the people I've referred to, he was also, of course, Eric's nearest geographical neighbour. And I think Laing is particularly worthy of attention. This is not least because both men in their different fields and institutional settings found inspiration in the work of Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre, a writer whose considerations and reconsiderations of dialectical materialism in relation to psychoanalysis and vice versa. That work, Sartre's work, drew upon, informed, challenged the efforts of a number of the other authors that I've spoken about so far. And Sartre was engaged in this work, in this endless deliberation, during the very years in which Eric Mottram himself came of intellectual age. Sartre's appeal no doubt included his criticisms of Marxism's inadequate accounts of identity, its susceptibility to various determinisms, as well as Sartre's skepticism about Freudian notions of the unconscious and the ways in which psychoanalysis lent itself to oppressive and exploitative purposes. But Sartre's appeal also owed much to his existential phenomenology. However important structures and institutions were, for Sartre, as for Mottram, as for R.D. Laing, there was always a sense that individual human freedom, expressed in praxis, was ontologically a priori. It came first, and that carried ethical implications. Alan referred a little bit to ethics in relation to aesthetics earlier. That carried ethical implications and responsibilities. It was just such a sense that led me to entitle this talk using a line from William Burroughs' Nova Express. Bring together state of news. It's Inspector Lee right at the beginning of that novel. Bring together state of news, inquire onward from state to doer. And Eric certainly did both. Also important to him were the potentials that Sartre ascribed to literature and to other artworks. His beliefs that as products of an autonomous, authentic, outgoing, socially responsible self, these works were public gifts. They embodied, they expressed, they communicated human freedom, they had aesthetic, they had political value. These convictions that I think Eric absorbed from Sartre, these convictions were enacted not least in the classroom. Teaching for Mottram was a particular form of gift-giving. And in spite of the numbers of students that took Eric's courses, he sought to conduct any class, at least in my experience, to conduct any class as a temporary polis, with a corresponding sensitivity to its purpose, to its value. The lecture, the seminar, was an occasion where authority was granted in light of the teacher's knowledge, of the teacher's commitment, and responsibility was taken accordingly. The vertical dimensions of the class were the relationship between the teacher and the students. Those dimensions were contingent. The horizontal dimension were integral, essential. And the form was therefore a matter of practice as much as of plan. I'm sure I'm not the only person in this room who went to an Eric class that was meant to finish at such and such a time and dragged on, with Eric apologizing for, and then there's one more thing, and there were questions from us as students, from the audience, and that would generate a discussion, which Eric was always, in my experience, happy to engage with. That, to my mind, was a sense of the politics of his teaching. If Eric Mottram's engagements with Marx and psychology, informed by Sartre's existentialism, throw light on his politics, those politics also, I think, changed over time, as I suggested in my opening remarks. During the 1970s in particular, both structuralist and post-structuralist challenges to dialectics, to psychoanalysis, to Sartre's existential Marxism, all of those played into Eric's thinking. They did so moreover, in a historical context, including the events of 1968 in Europe and the United States, the end of the post-war economic boom, the dispersal of the counterculture, the breakup of the New Left, the resurgence of the political right, all of which will have lent those intellectual challenges of structuralism and post-structuralism greater weight. But how, why, to what extent all of those things informed upon Eric's politics, I think, are difficult questions to judge. Eric was definitely enthused by the writings of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari from Anti-Oedipus onwards. I well remember being introduced to that. Eric's insistence, you should read this book. Their critiques of sublimation, their notion of desiring production, read as if they were new answers to questions that Wilhelm Reich had raised in the 1930s and R.D. Laing in the 1960s. Eric found their ideas about deterritorialization, rhizomes, field theory valuable, as he did aspects of Derrida's work with its critique of attachments to center and drives to completion. Clive nicely, thank you very much, took that apart Eric's essay on Derrida, on structure, sign, and play, that essay, in the collection that Bob Lee edited in Permanence, etc., in the late 1980s. It is worth both Eric's essay on Derrida and Clive's essay that pulls apart what Eric was doing with Derrida. Both deserve careful attention. Eric took Foucault's explorations of sovereignty, discipline, biopower, to be useful probes across the complex fluctuating contours of authority, not least vis-à-vis ideas of law. And of course, in the latter years of his life, Eric was much preoccupied with notions of law. Power as repressive force, as contractual right, as possession, as flow, and facilitated his considerations of the forms and mechanisms of power, from punishment to surveillance, when addressing individuals or whole populations, whether enacted as therapy and training or the Daily Mail's favourite, health and safety. The distinction that Foucault drew between power as a strategic relationship and power as domination was also of use, I think, for Eric, not least in relation to teaching. Eric saw his own authority as fostering a capability amongst his students, a power too. It was very much an exercise in enabling us. At the same time, and finally, I suspect that Eric had his reservations about the critics I've mentioned latterly, partly on political grounds. I doubt that he was all that keen on Foucault's assertion that man is an invention of recent date and one perhaps nearing its end. His concerns about what Deleuze called the cold and concerted destruction of the subject might have applied equally vis-à-vis Derrida, whose ideas could also decenter actual common or garden human beings. Did these critics not imply that Burroughs' admonition, inquire onward from state to doer, led into a cul-de-sac, there being no doer left to question? Deleuze and Guattari, for their part, look set to drive the subject down the street at speed and into a brick wall, with no insurance, no bath bag, no seatbelts, no ambulance. If Mottram sometimes cited Norman O'Brown's Love's Body on boundary breaking, a passage I've heard him recite, quote, many occasions. If Mottram sometimes cited Norman O'Brown's Love's Body on boundary breaking, he added that Dionysus needed the social context of viable revolution if it is not to re-energize the status quo. What would come of Foucault's interest in seeing the subject brought to its annihilation, he might well have asked. Where would Deleuze and Guattari's radical politics of desire lead their desiring machines? If assumptions about the existence of the Oedipus complex were so harmful, would their schizoanalysis be available on his father's NHS? Ultimately, there was also an aesthetic, a disciplinary, and artistic basis, I think, for Eric's reservations. Although he paid great attention to methods, Eric also saw artists and their works, not philosophy or theory, as primary. In this regard, as novelist, playwright, and philosopher with political commitments, his fellow libertarian socialist, Jean-Paul Sartre, I think retained a respect that Eric's younger contemporaries weren't quite afforded. To put it another way, all of them may have been of the left, one way or another, but none was a writer, none was an artist in quite the same way. That's it.